wrong screen to share. I always get confused on them. Okay, great. Can you all see the slides?
Yep, that's fine.
Yep,
that's great.
Perfectly. Let me also turn my camera on, because then you can associate a face with my voice. Great. So, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I am a third-year PhD student in Mechanical Materials and Manufacturing Engineering at the University of Nottingham, as was just mentioned. And I think it's good to note at this stage, whilst I say I'm from engineering, my research is definitely based on a sort of more social or human approach than a technological one, but that will definitely become very clear as I present today. So the underlying question that I'm going to sort of try and answer today is, how can policymakers and practitioners use energy technologies to more effectively alleviate poverty in Nepal? And so to start, I'm going to talk to you about a few of the projects that I've been involved with over the years and how it's sort of shaped my view of the energy technology for poverty alleviation sector, which, for simplicity, as that's a bit of a mouthful, let's just call the humanitarian energy sector. This sector sort of encompasses a range of low-income and displaced peoples across the globe who fight for survival on a daily basis, as they do not have access to basic services such as water, shelter, food, and energy. So all of my work in my PhD has resulted in what I feel is an important step forwards in the understanding of how policymakers and practitioners can implement or deliver these technologies slightly more effectively. And by poverty alleviating technology, I would include things like the implementation of off-grid solar energy access, also access to improved cooking technologies such as electric hobs, improved biomass cookstoves, LPG or biogas, and even lighting and heating, other lighting and heating systems. And I think it's important to stress at this point, the model that I designed is applicable to a number of sectors outside of Nepal, which I think is really important. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that useful if it was just relevant for Nepal. So, a bit of background on me. My route into the sort of international development sector was through Raleigh International. And for the last 5 years, I've actually been a trustee at Raleigh, where I've co-chaired a youth advisory board with 26 members from 15 countries who connect into the 40,000 strong alumni network. I also have sort of a mentoring scheme with the current CEO and contribute to building long-term development strategy as my role as a trustee. And it's a pretty great gig. And the strategy document you can see on the screen is really a culmination of the 5 years of work that I've put in. So Raleigh is a really fantastically dynamic organization. So why am I mentioning Raleigh International to you? So it's interesting because this role gives me a perspective that most PhD students don't get. A high-level view into a multi-million-pound development organization who really is at the sharp end of development initiatives. A real, true practitioner perspective, sharing real-life experience. I think often PhD students can get very stuck in the theory and forget about the real world application of their work. And that sort of theory practice paradigm is something that comes up repeatedly in my research. And I think especially in humanitarian energy, it's really important that PhD students work on stuff that is actually really practically applicable. So this was my introduction into Nepal. In 2015, as many of you may know, Nepal experienced a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, destroying nearly a million standing structures and displacing around 3 million people. In 2016, I was part of a humanitarian rebuilding effort with Live to Love International, and I was sent to design, implement, and manage an improved cooking program for the most badly affected, situated in the Sindhu region, just northeast of Kathmandu on the Chinese border. These communities had really been totally destroyed, as you can see in the photo. And it's impossible to describe the emotions that I felt when talking to the man in the central photo. Without help, he definitely was going to die where he sits, and that was really, really shocking to me. And it was a real introduction into incredible people who need fighting for in this unstable civilization that we all live in, and obviously especially unstable in the last few years. I've also worked in more market-based initiatives for poverty alleviation. This is a business that I started called Bottle by Bottle. It was a social enterprise committed to quite literally building sustainable future in Nepal by utilizing waste plastic bottles. The house you can see top left is the first house that we built, and the bottom left is the plastic bottle depot where most of the bottles came from. And as an interesting fact, this depot alone collects around 40,000 plastic bottles a day in Kathmandu, which is extraordinary. This was my real first experience in dealing with a range of key stakeholders, government officials, local businesses, the people we're building houses for, through a non-traditional development tool. And it really highlighted the importance of engaging with all those people. We couldn't have done it without cross-sectoral support from all of those key stakeholders. And so just for fun, this is what I did for the first 6 months of my PhD. I was running a company before I started, when I left university the first time. And the idea was to promote poverty alleviating technologies through a range of sectors and create a platform between technology users and academics or practitioners, connecting basically people with money to people who needed help. We ran an adventure, as was mentioned briefly in the introduction, and it ranged through, it was over 14 months, 55,000 kilometers, 30 countries, conflict zones, national parks. And we also ran a number of sort of social enterprise orientated projects around, one was building wheelchairs out of old bits of mountain bike to help disabled access in remote parts of Ghana. And the other one was a borehole project in Kenya, again, building another social enterprise. You can see there's a theme here. And this overlapped, as I said, with the first 6 months of my PhD, and definitely had a significant impact on my perspective. So the actual PhD. This is my title, but as you all know, these things are slightly subject to change, especially at the writing up stage, at which I'm currently in. Before we jump into all of the sort of research objectives, etc., I think it's important to sort of set the scene, give you all some energy context. So the global energy sector is framed by the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And without going into too much detail, these goals set out the pathway for a sustainable world for all by 2030. How realistic these targets are and how impactful the SDGs are is definitely up for debate, but it does provide a cohesive roadmap for development practitioners, policymakers, small NGOs, big development partners like the UN. It provides a roadmap for them to be able to coordinate their response. So looking at SDG 7, this is focused on energy and made up of a number of sub-goals. But I think what is most interesting about all of these goals is that they link into so many other goals. They're not separate in their own right. They come as a package. And SDG 7 links into many, if not all, of the goals. The table top left, the little graph top left, gives you an idea as to sort of the indicators that are tracked. The one that's missing is energy efficiency, but that gives you a kind of a good idea of where the globe is at on average. So, in Nepal, the energy context in Nepal falls against quite a long history of international development work, where there are actually 40,000 active NGOs working in Kathmandu. The energy statistics are actually somewhat misleading here, as 94% access to electricity does not account for the rate of connectivity. For a number of years after the 2015 earthquake, I experienced the 16-hour-a-day load shedding, and still now, even when I was there beginning of last year, there are still power outages for a few hours a day. and Kathmandu is the center of energy for Nepal. And the renewable energy access has actually decreased from 95% in the last 25 years due to the move away from sustainably managed forest firewood and towards LPG imported from India. There's an interesting debate around that I'm not going to have today. But as can be seen by the figure in the bottom, 65.8% of rural households still use firewood as their main source of cooking energy. And that's sort of broadly reflected in the 29% access to clean cooking stats. However, what's problematic about these statistics is they don't account for stacking or using cooking technologies concurrently, similar to how we all in our own kitchens use a kettle to boil water, a toaster for toast, a microwave, gas and electric hobs. Nepalis often use fire for roti, which are like a sort of a pancake, LPG for guests because it has a social status associated with it. Improved cookstoves in the summer, metallic improved cookstoves so they can move them outside and they're a bit more easy to use and get away from the heat. And so those statistics really don't capture those. The National Planning Commission only captures main cooking fuel, so it can distort what the actual reality is. And so to give you a bit more of an idea of Nepal as a place, these are a few pictures from a previous project where we looked to understand how institutions influence cooking behaviors in Nepal. This specific community is at about 2,800 meters. It's about 120 kilometers north of Kathmandu, and it took us 6 hours on a bus and then another 6 hours to walk there. And that was when it wasn't snowing. So in the winter, this village is completely submerged by snow and completely cut off, even though it's only about 100 kilometers away from Kathmandu. There are no real tarmac roads outside of Kathmandu, so obviously transport and getting to places is really difficult. This is a fairly typical mid-hills farm, so that's anywhere from 1,500 meters to 2,500 meters after the earthquake. Normally, these buildings would all be stone, but unfortunately, they were knocked down. And you see piles of stones around with people waiting to rebuild their houses. This is sort of a low hills house at about 1,000 meters. That's a farm. That's actually one of the farms we worked with. And on the left, you can see a sort of outdoor kitchen. On the right, you can see where the livestock's kept. And then there's an alcohol stove just around the back, which is, again, another stacked cooking technology. This is a pretty wealthy institutional kitchen. This is an example of a monastery in the high hills, and that's what they cook on. This is an example of a household kitchen. The reason they had a rocket stove there is because they were part of Live to Love's program back in 2016. And that's pretty typical of a household kitchen, a 3-stone fire. Yeah, and I think originally that would have had a chimney outside, but now it doesn't. So this institutional project was actually quite interesting because we built 10 institutional cook stoves that we designed in conjunction with Live to Love and then tested in the field over 3 years. Here's just one of our pilot sites. This was a farmer who was able to save enough firewood to buy another cow. That took his total up to 6 cows, but unfortunately the cook stove only could cook enough food for 5 cows. So that caused a problem in itself, which was quite interesting. Here's a school pilot we worked with, and they saved about $400 a month on LPG because they could sustainably harvest firewood from their local forest. But I think what was most interesting, and I don't know the next slide, but I think what was most interesting about this project in the context of my research is it represented a major phase change in my understanding of the humanitarian energy sector, whether it was my own prejudice as an engineer, what I'd been taught, the context I grew up in, or the literature that I was reading at the time. I had always read or thought that the better or more technologically advanced the technology, the higher the possibility of adoption and sustained use. In this case, I thought the schools would use them more if they were more effective, more efficient. But when running the pilot, usability always came before efficiency. And what became very quick, very important, very fast in this project was that the complex sociocultural, environmental, and financial contextual factors that were specific to Nepali institutions, even specific to the individual pilot sites, they were the things that were fast becoming the barriers to the adoption and sustained use of these cookstoves, not how well the cookstove burnt wood. The social context was then as important, or in some cases more important, than the technology itself. And hats off to the social scientists, they had seen this coming. At that point, I had not. This was my real introduction into implementation or delivery models, and also my introduction into the lack of engineers who thought about these kind of things in this way. So in addition to all of that, as I said earlier, there was a bit of overlap with the company that I was running around Africa and my PhD, and that's what resulted in what I like to call my PhD literature review on the go. Because it was quite literally, the first year of my PhD was a combination of experiences around Africa combined with academic discourse in my area of study. So I was quite literally reading literature one day and then see it in practice or be implementing it the next day, whether it was community programs or in the school you see below there, or the role that technology can play in human-wildlife conflict. I was really getting to experience these first things firsthand, whilst concurrently building research skills and understanding the role of context in technology implementation. An experience that added immensely to my PhD work, and one that not very many people get, and I was very lucky to do that. But I think it definitely has improved the quality myself as a researcher and the quality of research that I've done. So with all that, these are my research objectives. So the overarching aim of the research was for us to design this model that can help practitioners and policymakers identify these complex contextual issues that often act as barriers, and how they could build them into the implementation of energy technologies in these sort of more humanitarian energy sectors. Simply, how can we use technology to reduce poverty? And what sociocultural, environmental, financial mechanisms do we need to understand to make these projects work better? And what methods can we use to use these technologies more effectively? Especially in the energy sector, low-income households have been targeted, but with limited success, even doubly so in the cookstove sector. So basically, we made an assumption that the social technical divide was why people didn't use these technologies past 6 months or 1 year. So then we had to come up with a model. So I call it a theoretical framework here. And through the literature review process, we identified a number of areas in which we saw potential for the creation of a new way of implementing and possibly evaluating these humanitarian energy technologies, which would hopefully be useful in Nepal and could, fingers crossed, apply to other markets as well. And so there were 4 main areas that we focused on: appropriate technology, social enterprise, water, sanitation and hygiene, behavioral change models, and general international development literature focused on how you track behavioral change, things like log frames and theory of change. So as a quick summary of those 4 groups, appropriate technology is a design movement started by E.F. Schumacher, focused on the creation of technologies that are relevant to a specific context. Designing is with what is available rather than what is technically best. So it's quite a pure engineering design movement. And whilst it seems like the way to go, it actually hasn't really had any legs and is yet to gain serious momentum because it really lacks an appropriate dissemination strategy. And so this is sort of where we thought social enterprise would link in, started by Mohammed Yunus in the 1970s to provide microloans to low-income rural people in Bangladesh who did not have access to traditional banking systems due to their lack of collateral. Social enterprise is a way of disseminating traditionally a service through a low-income population. Effectively, it's a business who values money and impact equally. And both of these sort of ideas had been used in the energy sector before, but never really sort of together. So we also looked at existing models outside the energy sector, which is where the WASH models come in, because the WASH sector has already, well, quite a while ago, started to transition from a hardware-orientated approach, building stuff, to a software or behavioral side approach. And that sort of gives a bit of a roadmap to where energy should be going in the future. We also focused on tools, more specifically like, as I said, log frames, the responsible research and innovation framework, again, like I said, theory of change, and finance models such as results-based financing, which is championed by the British government at the moment. We extracted and analyzed the core themes and frameworks from all of these different models that were out there. There were quite a few. And we deemed 4 of them critical for the sustained use of humanitarian energy technologies. And these were the 4 that we identified. And so co-production, ownership, utilization, and equality. So just to quickly run through them, co-production looks at how you co-produce technologies with key stakeholder groups. The bottom-up, top-down sort of development models filters into this way of thinking is that all key stakeholders' opinions are valued equally, and they all have equal ownership in the co-production of the technology or implementation model. Ownership is about how you get buy-in from end users. So taking inspiration from social enterprise, looking at how we can get people involved. Utilization looks at how you utilize existing local materials, resources, people, and systems to create efficient and culturally aligned strategies. And that sort of feeds into the appropriate technology concept. And finally, equality. So equality is about ensuring that the intervention is equal and just for all. A concept that runs through all of the literature groups to some extent. How do you communicate? Is it inclusive? Are you giving flyers to users who cannot read? Are you taking into account the role of gender in context? For example, are you doing cooking demonstrations with men? Traditionally in Nepal, men don't cook. So doing a cooking demonstration with a man is actually not great. So taking that all into account, and also some of the structures from the existing frameworks, we came up with this, and this is very basic. But there are 2 distinct elements. So one is the co-production element, and the other, which focuses on sort of the more behavioral determinant side of things. And the other one is the enabling environment matrix, which is on the left-hand side, which focuses on understanding the roles, perspectives, and interactions of your key stakeholders, which have been given rough societal groupings taken from a behavior model called IBM WASH, Integrated Behavior Model for WASH, as a way of keeping things simple. But there was a big question that loomed overhead. Talked a lot about theory now, and I like to bang on about how it's got to work in practice as well. So were we heading in the right direction? How can we then ask some people some questions that prove this sort of point? So to test the sort of initial framework, we did a load of interviews with some Global Challenges Research Fund project. We actually did 5 interviews. I wouldn't say that's a load actually, but it did involve systematically reviewing all 882 GCRF projects, which was quite extensive. And it actually only found 6 that were sort of in this energy SDG 7 technology enterprise sort of space, which I think is quite an underrepresentation. And these projects range from about 100K to about £5 million. I won't go into the results in detail, but as sort of a simple overview, the left-hand table is the enabling environment matrix. The right-hand table is a graphical representation of a perception from one key stakeholder. So how they perceive all the other levels, the importance of the other levels. The bottom right table, the bottom right pie chart is about how people, the perceived weighting of resources between those 2 4 factors. And then very simply, just a word map to see what people talk about most. And so a few iterations later, this is what we came up with. And I think this is a good time to dive a bit deeper into what this is and what it does. So we called it the Technology Implementation Model for Energy, or TIME, because it leads to many snappy journal type paper titles like Time to Change, for example. And there are 3 things which this really does. Well, it does lots of things, but there are 3 core things that it does. It identifies the complex socio-cultural, environmental, financial, contextual factors through a qualitative methods, through a qualitative research strategy. It also maps the roles and responsibilities of those key stakeholder groups in terms of those core factors that we deemed were really important to the sustained use of technologies. And it also understands the interactions between the key stakeholders. I don't know if you can see that. Let's put this up here. And so how does it do that? Right. So as I said, the strategic planning element looks to capture behavioral determinants, these complex contextual issues that act as barriers to technology adoption and sustained use. And so, and also you want to turn those barriers into enablers. So at all times with the strategic planning element, these decisions are being made through the lens of co-production, with information definitely coming from end users, but also other key stakeholders in the technology value chain. Co-produced value is key as each stakeholder brings an individual knowledge to the table, and it's important to equally weigh that knowledge. One key stakeholder group does not have veto over another. This can be especially challenging as we all know research funders want really specific outputs, and end user needs change in both space and time. And again, it's worth reinforcing, while end user preference is key, other stakeholders also play a vital role. The existing body of sort of participatory literature struggles with this balance of power between user and practitioner, which really has no right answer. This top-down, bottom-up model can only be corrected through careful consideration of all views. So if I was to illustrate the process that happens in the strategic planning element with an example, let's say the interviews with key stakeholder groups identifying that finance is the reason for end users not investing in an improved technology. So that would be the purpose and need box at the top. There would be a finance behavioral determinant. When looking closely at your assumptions, you assume that this means users do not have any spare cash to invest in cooking or any energy technology. However, when consulting the actual users, the reasoning is actually willingness to pay, as the household has a number of financial priorities, which cooking is not one. Many technology-based initiatives assume that people want these technologies rather than identifying actual end user need or preference. So once the purpose has been realigned with user priorities, as well as the assumptions and expectations, a participation or engagement strategy can be created which takes this into account. So hopefully transforming a barrier into an enabler. In this financial example, it would require some form of demand-side intervention through an incentive to move cooking up the list of priorities, or in conjunction with some other intervention that satisfies the priorities above cooking. The engagement factor is where the strategic planning element meets the enabling environment matrix, linking the actions of key stakeholder groups to the behavioral change of technology end users. And so, talking of the enabling environment matrix, this focuses on the role and responsibilities of the key stakeholder groups and how these key stakeholder groups interact in terms of the core factors, as I mentioned earlier. The thinking behind this is that every key stakeholder, be that government, policymaker, manufacturer, distributor, field partner, or member of the community, has influence on the behavioral choices of the technology end user. On the left-hand side of the matrix, you can see the key stakeholder groups that I talked about earlier. And from the interviews, the GCRF interviews, they changed a little bit, but they broadly remain the same. So we felt they were good groupings, good groupings, and provided the information that we needed. Along the top, you can see the other three factors. And so the result of this structure is that when data is coded into the matrix from the qualitative semi-structured interviews that you have with all of your key stakeholders, each key stakeholder group then produces their own enabling environment matrix from their own perspective. And so because there are 5 groups, you then have 5 enabling environment matrices. And this sounds complicated, but it's actually where it gets very interesting. If a project is working well and everyone understands their own roles and others' responsibilities, the matrices will be the same no matter the perspective, right? But in reality, when we did this process, they did not match. And it really effectively highlighted the differences in opinion about how the project was going and what people's roles and responsibilities were, and very effectively was able to close some of the project deficiencies. So then the final step in this whole process is reflection. How has this engagement strategy affected technology demand? What improvements can we make? And is the end user preference the same as when we started? So then when you start getting into that question, it starts to become a cyclical process. And that's why I mentioned evaluation at the beginning. Because of that cyclical nature, you could do this process throughout the project stages to track how things were going. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the purpose and need can change in both space and time. And in Nepal especially, contextual changes can happen extraordinarily quickly. One example being the Indian fuel blockade on Nepal, where suddenly there was no LPG or diesel one day, and biomass cookstove use spiked massively, or slowly, like the introduction of smart devices and the effect that can have on rural communities. So now I had a model. Had a sort of a general model, an idea of how it was all meant to work, and I needed some data, and it was time to get into the field. So I spent 4 months in Nepal working with Practical Action on their $2 million results-based financing project. And this was funded by Energizing Development as part of a group of international development practitioners like GIZ, DFID, as part of the UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative. And there's a link there if you want to go check it out. This project, RBF, was designed to increase the adoption of improved cookstoves through market mechanisms. These mechanisms include building the capacity on the supply side and creating demand through awareness campaigns. There were 2 phases of RBF. Phase 1 was around 40,000 cookstoves. Phase 2 was around 5,000 cookstoves with behavioral change. And the proposals for both of those projects were exactly the same, except the title for with behavioral change was just different. And that I guess should have been a bit of an alarm bell. And so as you can see from the slide, I had a range of research objectives aimed at evaluating the program and providing a series of recommendations for Practical Action using this sort of framework and methodology for improving their project and hopefully more generally in their organizational systems. And these objectives were very much in line with the outputs of the model or the time, and that is definitely not a coincidence. So methodology, rather than putting lines and lines of code on the screen, I thought maybe I should show you some more pictures. So we utilized and built upon the data collection methods from the GCRF interviews to capture what we wanted. And we were really looking at capturing the lived experience of all these key stakeholder groups in the value chain. We were interested in their perceptions of the projects and how they thought things were going, what could be better, etc., etc. These photos, again, give you a good idea of context. And the top left photo is one of the villages that we went to. That village is around 250 kilometers west of Kathmandu, and again, 8 hours in a bus, followed by 4 hours on the back of a jeep up a mountain. So quite remote. And I think special mention should actually go to my research assistant when we were there, Pratik, who definitely, his kind, considerate and measured approach made us many friends in the area we were working in. And actually we were so welcome that it almost was caused some issues at some point, but I can talk about them afterwards. And so on the right hand side, you see the snow-covered peaks there. Maybe I move this down, then you can see the snow-covered peaks. And that is the Mustang Range, one of the most beautiful and remote parts of the Himalayas on the planet. It's really very beautiful and pretty limited in infrastructure, yet pretty fantastic 4G connections, one of the many contradictions of rural Nepali life. Middle right, you can see a kitchen, which actually has 7 different cooking technologies in it. And the reason for having so many cooking technologies in this specific case was that LPG or kerosene or diesel or firewood, those supply chains were so limited that they could drop off any day and they would transition to another technology to be able to still feed themselves. And the bottom left is a cookstove distributor, fairly typical, located in the city. You see bottom right, a city called Bangalore. And so we conducted 32 formal interviews, around 10 informal interviews across stakeholders based in Kathmandu and in the field, to give a good cross-section of what practical action we're doing. And so after some detailed qualitative analysis of the interview transcripts, which more commonly is known as magic in some fields, we had some results. And so I'll just give you a quick overview. There was loads of results. There were 5,000 data points, and there are only 12 here. So it just gives you a quick overview. I think firstly, in terms of the purpose of the project, it's interesting to note that the way in which you define success is very important. Practical Action had the aim of selling 40,000 cookstoves, which they definitely did. However, the aim was definitely not around the sustained use of this cookstoves. If evaluating around this, or even asking questions like, do end users have ownership over this technology? Have the local systems been utilized effectively? Did everyone get equal access? The answer is sort of no, no, and no. And to top it all off, only 5% of households were actually monitored. And to sort of help highlight some project differences, we actually divided the results in the purpose and need category in this behavioral determinants into 2 phases. Phase 1 represented the perceptions of various key stakeholders in Kathmandu Valley, and phase 2 represented the actual community or end user needs. And as you can see on the slide, these perspectives are very different. The major difference being that key stakeholders based in Kathmandu Valley were adamant that rural Nepalis didn't understand the benefits of using improved cookstoves. And when asked the question to our end users in the field, they said, don't be ridiculous, we've had improved cookstoves here for 50 years. Of course we know what the benefits of improved cookstoves are, which was an interesting cause for concern. And so each of those sub-factors actually produces a table like this with a ranking that gets generated from the coding wizardry. And there's definitely a lot more work you could do with this element, but this is what we wanted at the moment. We really just wanted to identify the top 5 things that are important in all of these categories. And so jumping onto the enabling environment matrix, this is an example of one of those key stakeholder group perspectives. This is the user and non-user perspective. We grouped them together because that's what Practical Action wanted. And so, again, I'm not going to go into crazy details because there are thousands of data points. But if you look in the table on the right-hand side of the screen, there is nothing in coordinating partner. And so the coordinating partner is Practical Action. And bottom left, there is nothing in the coordinating partner element, which meant that out of the 5 communities and 20 people we talked to, no one who had either bought a cookstove from the Practical Action program or lived in a community where the Practical Action program had heard of Practical Action and who they were. So definitely a breakdown in communication there. So this all resulted in a series of recommendations. That could hopefully help Practical Action better understand the behavioral side of their project. And I know I've talked about a few of the negative things, but there were a lot of positive things with their project. And it's worth stressing that I didn't tell them it was all gloom and doom. They were actually doing some really incredible work. There were just a few things that were surprising. And so these recommendations, they were based around communication, around how key stakeholders communicate with them, between themselves and also with the end users. Also understanding on a very basic level why people want to purchase cookstoves, so that maybe you could tailor the program a bit more effectively. There's one recommendation on financial incentives that I will talk about a bit in a sec. And also this difference between focusing on adoption and sustained use. So there are three things that I really want to highlight from this whole experience that I thought were really interesting about Nepal and the RBF project. So the first is this idea of reputational risk. So in Nepal, project procurement works in an interesting way in which you're told by your local government where you can work. And so if you live in a community that sits on the edge of a district, you can have two different development partners running the same program at a different price. So in the practical action project had a certain amount of subsidy for each cookstove bought, but say the Red Cross program next door had a slightly bigger amount of subsidy for each cookstove bought. And so what happens is the people in these communities selling the cookstoves, they are the local distributors, the local financial cooperatives, they aren't communicated with effectively to be able to tell the technology end users what the subsidy system is. They just get a price. So then as a community member, you see two different prices for the same thing, almost geographically identical locations, and suddenly you have accusations flying around of your local financial cooperative trying to make money out of you. And so that actually created quite a reputational risk for these local distributors being involved in these kind of projects. The second thing is social influence. Nepali society, in the areas that we were doing the data collection, has an interesting three-dimensional social influence when it comes to technology adoption. The first one is older generations, grandparents and parents saying, I've cooked over an open fire all my life and I don't have any, and I'm as fit as anything, and I can walk up a mountain, and why do I need to change my behaviors? I've been fine, I always will be fine, and my kids will be fine. The second element is from the young people who are traditionally more educated than the older generations, saying to their parents and grandparents, look, cookstoves are bad, we really need to do something about this. And then the third aspect is social media and the influence of social media in Nepal, especially in these rural communities, because I mentioned now they will have 4G connections, is huge. And there is a lifestyle influence on that. So young people also want to have more leisure time. They don't want to work in the fields, and that can also influence the technology that they choose, especially for their cooking. And the final thing is stacking. Every Nepali kitchen we walked into had at least 7 cookstoves. So the problem is that then initiatives designed for Nepal don't take that into account. And the subsidy policy run by the government also doesn't take that into account, which means that the understanding needs to change from this idea of a energy ladder going from open fire to improved cookstove to electric hob to a multi-dimensional model that satisfies all needs through all those cooking technologies. Otherwise, people are just going to adopt and discard like they're currently doing. So the future. These two kiddos were at the top of a mountain and very, very cool. It's just nice to include in the slides. So what's there still to do in the PhD? As I said earlier, I'm writing up. And if we look back at my research objectives, actually, due to Corona, I haven't been able to complete the 4th one because I wanted to go conduct this process on another project in another market. But I've been stuck in the UK, so that hasn't been able to happen with good reason. And I've actually already put together the first draft of my thesis and hopefully we'll submit it. So there's 2 pieces of work that I'm focusing on now. One of them is developing a user guide so that practitioners and policymakers and researchers can use this tool in the field. It's really important that it's accessible and easily communicated. But I don't think there'll be time for me to finish this in the scope of the PhD. So I'm also looking for a small pot of money to be able to finish that user guide. That would be really great. The second piece of work that is going on at the moment is a scientific research expedition that documents the energy lives of the displaced in the Sahel. The Sahel, for those of you who don't know, is on the southern border of the Sahara Desert, and all countries in the Sahel have energy access rates of less than 30%. And due to the destabilized geopolitical environment, a lot of displaced people. The idea is to make a few films, tell some incredible stories, raise the issue of humanitarian energy access up the international agenda, and also complete a world first by crossing the Sahel in a vehicle. And so, yeah, just before I come to a close, these are all the people who made this, everything that I've put up today happen, and without these people I wouldn't be able to do it, so huge thank you to them. And so 3 takeaways. If you take away 3 things from what I said today, they're this. Champion a co-produced approach to humanitarian energy access. No one's views are valued more or less. And the difference between perception and reality will be less if you co-produce those approaches. Also, identifying what is perception and what is reality. Do people actually want cooking interventions? Basic questions that people don't ask and results in some interesting consequences. And this final idea of rethinking impact. How is measuring adoption enough, or do we need to think about sustained use? Do we need to transition from a metric dominated evaluation criteria to a values dominated evaluation criteria? And I think we do, but that's difficult for funders. So that's everything I wanted to speak about today. There's a bit of reading here for anyone who wants to do a bit more reading. So any questions?
Thank you so much, Ben. That was a fantastic talk. Some lovely images there. I particularly liked your environmental enabling matrix graph. I think we could talk at length about that. But there's a few hands up in the chat. So I'm going to pass over to Elena first, because I see you've got your hand up.
I think I was first, actually. Well, thank you, Ben. It's been such a delight to listen to you. A fabulous presentation, and really beyond the subject matter that you have spoken about, which is so close to my heart and many of the people on this call today. It's really a model of delivery for your stage in the PhD that is fabulous for everyone to aspire to. So I'm very pleased that you accepted our invitation and you delivered so stellarly. Now, I think you know a little bit about our work in HEAT with communities, maybe to the same sort of more engineering effect rather than a theoretical framework with applicability for technology deployment in humanitarian settings. So when I looked at your four pillars of the co-production, ownership, utility, and equality, I was wondering whether you left any space for something else, for a category on others, because I think if I may say that is really significant. We came to believe that those 4 elements in many settings may just not be enough, and what is missing, maybe the first and biggest one, would be acquiring an understanding, a joint understanding. The joint understanding of the co-production would be very different. So I'm really wanting you to hear whether you reasoned about being more space than the four things there in the foundation of your framework.
Yeah, I think the reason why we picked those 4 elements was, and it was a while ago now, was not to uninclude other things, but because they were the easily identified pillars that resonated through lots of projects. And if there were other things that came out of the woodwork as we sort of went on this journey of developing this model, then we could add them in. So there is actually quite a lot of change in the model in those 2 slides that I showed you, between sort of the first idea, which was literally just post-its on a table about how all of this would go together, and what we came up with after we finished working with practical action. So I wouldn't want to uninclude anything as long as it didn't increase the complexity for practitioners, because a lot of academic models tread that line between being having really meaningful outputs and being too complex for someone to just pick it up and apply it to a project and move on. That sort of answers your question in a roundabout way.
Yes, very much so. I mean, we are very, very keen to produce things that are simple enough for practitioners to pick up and go with, even if they are maybe theoretically not necessarily complete. Very much so. I just wanted to make sure that in your view of the world, there is still space to develop.
100%. And actually, one of the interesting developments is through the in the strategic planning element, there's the purpose or need section, which develops behavioral determinants. And I think there in that specific element, there is definitely more work to be done on how that links into the more behavioral in the water and sanitation behavioral change models. There is groupings of behavioral determinants that would be beneficial to do through sort of utilizing some of those other works. So I think it's just a baseline, isn't it? That's what I was trying to create. I was trying to create something that people could say, cool, this works, but we need to change it for this, or we needed to change it for this. And that would be great.
Fantastic. And what's your next career step?
Oh, yeah, jobs. I don't know. I'm developing this proposal with the Global Plan of Action with Sarah Rosenberg-Jansen, if you know her.
Yes, of course.
And we'll see. I mean, it'd be great to get that funded, but also it would be nice to have a postdoc, but I don't know if that's going to happen. Research seems like university funding does not seem like it's in research right now.
Yeah. Well, I wish you best of luck, and I hope that we are going to be co-producing loads of stuff between now and then, when then is your next career step.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have a question in the chat and a few hands raised. So perhaps I'll go just pick out Katazana's question in the chat, which was what an interesting one about how did you feel? Did any of this change you on a personal level? What did you learn about yourself, world, or people?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, is the answer to that question. I've been lucky enough to work all around the world in a number of different contexts, and every time you experience something completely out of your comfort zone, it changes you as a human being, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I think especially especially the African times, there are some specific times that have definitely changed me as a human being forever. I can think of one example off the top of my head was crossing the Nigerian and Cameroon border by myself in a civil war. That was something that definitely shaped me as a human being for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be many people who could say they've done that.
No, I don't think so.
Do you want to pick up on them? There's 3 hands up in the chat. I'll leave you to pick them up, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Would you like me just to choose one?
Yeah.
Should we go with Sarah? Because I think Sarah works for Practical Action.
Yeah, hi. Yeah,
Hello.
Sarah Begg here. Yeah, so I work for Practical Action, and yeah, ex-University of Nottingham Geography Department as well, so I'm sure we've got lots in common. I wanted to pick up on the rethinking impact. So you talked about sustained use and versus kind of cookstoves sold. My question was more about the temporal dimension of impact, and did you have any metrics in terms of, what you could put in place to think about sustained impact throughout the duration of a project. What I'm thinking is that kind of where that project would have been at the time is to be able to meaningfully measure sustained impact. You would need 2, 3, 5 years to be able to do that, kind of post exit. So did you think of the temporal element of that? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually a very difficult question. I think it's difficult. It's just difficult. It's difficult, and in terms of, I think it all comes from the way in which people think about cookstove, or especially cookstoves, all comes from the way in which people think they solve the energy problem. So in my opinion, cookstoves are a stepping stone to something better or greater, right? Whereas in a lot of projects, they are marketed as the thing that will solve all your energy issues. And so how do you, depending on how you have defined what piece of technology means to you at the beginning, will then define its long-term impacts. But then how you measure those impacts is really, really, really difficult. I guess in my case, it was because of the qualitative research methods sort of strategy that we're using, we sort of got a snapshot in time of how things were going. And I think to sustain that over a long time would be expensive and difficult. But yeah. I still think the mindset needs to change, whether there's the funding to back it up.
Great, thank you. And I think maybe some of those considerations in the user guide that you mentioned would be really helpful for practitioners just thinking about the temporal element and what funding is available at that time and what the focuses are at the time. So yeah, thanks for your answer. Great.
Yeah, no worries. And then one final question from Did I pronounce it right?
Hi, Ben. It's really nice presentation and thank you. I mean, and just to put into perspective, I come from Nepal, so so I know the geography and I've been working on this field for 15, 20 years now, almost over 15 years. But I did my PhD, one of the first one on mainly on the cook stoves as well. And I know practical action as well. So because I was invited by Practical Action and WHO in 2016 and 17 to give a talk in Nepal as well when they organized, and I've met quite a few people in the Practical Action. Yeah, just a few things. I mean, I'm looking at the time. One of the things which you mentioned was the top 10 behavioral determinants as well, which you picked among many for the change. I mean, I have been to quite few countries, looking at from Guatemala, where we spend most time in Nepal, but I come from the more on the plain regions where you have done in the hilly regions. But I know I've been to many hill regions as well. Looking at, I mean, I'm a researcher more looking on the health aspects as well. So looking at cardiovascular, respiratory, that's my area of research. When I visited to some countries, whether it was in Africa, in Uganda, or in Peru, or Guatemala, where I've spent, and in Nepal as well, India, other things. And I did in China as well. I worked with my PhD students on they work on this in China. You see a lot of cook stoves these, and when you manufacture these cook stoves, they work for certain time periods. I mean, you looked into some of the aspects. Once you leave that one, as you saw, there was stacking like 6, 7, 8 stoves in a house. They don't serve the purpose. I mean, something they reduce the time to cook, maybe less fuel, but the other things which is important as well, like the health aspects, they don't reduce the exposure to a label where you can see a significant health impacts.
Yeah.
Just giving you an example, when there was a plancha stove in Guatemala, I spent 10 years with, 10 days with Kirk Smith there in his, and some of the improved cook stove, the pollution was much higher in those. So have you looked into the exposure aspects as well, or are you planning to do some? I know you are a mechanical engineer trying to get there, but what is the purpose? I mean, whether it's just for limited time, and there are a lot of, so many other things which might impact the usability of the stores for a longer period where you don't see much benefits. So what do you think of that?
I didn't do any exposure measuring. I was really focused on more the behavioral change elements of the program. But I agree with you. There are plenty of studies that say if you cook on an open fire once a week, it's just as bad as cooking on it 7 days a week. And also, in terms of people having lots of different technologies, what we found was that each technology had a specific use, so that I could list the 7, but I can't remember them. So the outside 3-stone fire was only used for cooking for cows. The inside 3-stone fire was only used for things that required hot and fast times. So roti, frying momos, or occasionally if a rice needed to be left on all day. And then the LPG was used for guests. And it's interesting you say you're not from the hilly region, that the behavioral determinants actually changed depending on the valley we were in, specifically, and they definitely changed depending on the topography or the mountainous terrain. And so in one community,
my wife is from there, so I know. So although I'm not from there, so
yeah, nice. And so the topography definitely had a huge impact on the why people use those cooking technologies concurrently. But I think this is a round way of me saying that I didn't actually do any exposure monitoring. I was all on the qualitative side, really.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's probably worth mentioning I have done in the past, but not with this. With the institutional cooking project, we did some exposure monitoring, but the cook stoves are situated outside, so it was a bit more difficult. But yeah. Thank you for your question. Shall I just quickly answer the last question in the messenger? Why did I choose Nepal? By sheer coincidence, actually, it all started with a cup of tea in Gloucestershire in 2015. I bumped into someone who worked for an NGO that were working there, and that started the whole thing off, really. Nothing more than that. And then I guess a deep love of the country evolved from there.
And how did you get into doing a PhD though? Just because I know there's a few MSc students who are probably interested in.
How did I get into it? My supervisor roped me in.
Your MSc supervisor, was it?
Yeah, so I did an MEng, so I did integrated masters, which involved a project, and my supervisor for that project, roped me in, and I think it was a multitude of things. One, I wanted to do a PhD, sort of. I like the idea of being called a doctor. 2, 3, it was a great way to keep working in the sector I was working, and get paid for it. And I guess I wanted to become an expert in this area so that when I got to this stage, I could maybe get a job doing something like this.
Sounds good to me. Is there any other final questions before we wrap up from anyone?
Yes, Jonathan, can I ask Ben a question?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for a nice talk. Just a quick question. Did you say you did, you actually produced your framework before you carry out this survey?
Yeah, so a mixture. So developed sort of the theoretical element first, then
Yeah.
evaluated it through the interviews with GCRF primary investigators, and then had a sort of a pretty good idea of what I wanted to achieve. I then met Practical Action in Nepal, and they saw me speak at a conference, so they asked me to come do a bit of to do the piece of work for them. And then the version of it that you saw on the screen, the one that I chatted through in detail, that's sort of the most up-to-date version, taking into account the results from Nepal. And there's obviously a lot of other methodological steps in terms of analysis that I didn't include today because they're long and not so exciting. But yeah, it all sort of developed in and out of the practice theory paradigm.
So, I mean, practically speaking, how do you plan to have the framework implemented, you know, in practical terms?
In practical terms?
Yes.
So the framework is basically an analysis methodology. So identifying, in practical terms, the process is identify all the key stakeholder groups, then go and talk to them all, design a questionnaire, design a semi-structured interview guide that captures the things you want to capture, go talk to everyone, and then use the framework to conduct the piece of analysis which generates these tables and matrices that you can then analyze for to see those insights, those project efficiencies, the difference in roles, those kind of things. Those are the practical steps.
Thank you. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks for the question. Great, I guess that's it.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Ben. It sounds like there's going to be some people following up to ask you some more detailed questions, which is really nice to see. So
yeah, sure, and happy for anyone to send me an email if they'd like to. I would put my email address in the chat, but my Teams has decided that it's going to freak out and freeze, so I can't do that at the moment.
I can do that.
Okay, great.